We're talking today with Glenn Sheathelm of Muskegon, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, to begin with, Glenn, give us some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born here in Muskegon, Michigan. My dad was actually born in Lansing, mom here in Muskegon. They met playing tennis out at Pioneer Park when they had a tennis court up there. My dad and mom both had brothers that served during World War II. My heroes were quite frequently World War II vets. There were several that lived in the neighborhood, and of course I'm named after an uncle that was killed during World War II, also Glenn H. Sheathelm. He was killed between Remagen and Cologne in March of 1945.
All right, and what year were you born?
I was born in 1946.
Okay. All right, and what did your family do for a living when you were a kid?
My dad was a school teacher at Muskegon Public Schools. He had taught at a couple other schools before then, a place called Delton down near Hastings. And he came to Muskegon initially with because of Walt Mosner. Walt Mosner was the director of Camp Pendaluan. He'd been youth director at the Lansing YMCA, and my dad knew him real well from there. And Mosner asked my dad to come as a junior counselor to Pendaluan. So that's what brought my dad initially to Muskegon. And he liked the area. Later on, moved up to counselor, and then assistant camp director during the summer. And that included part of the time while he was teaching. Now, during World War II, in addition to teaching, he worked at Bennett Pumps. He and another printing teacher, I believe from Muskegon Heights High School, split a job printing instructions for Bennett Pumps products that were going to the military all over the world. Mm-hmm. So he figured that that was some way he could contribute to the war effort. He was actually on the borderline for being too old, but my parents decided not to have children until the war was over and they knew really what the future had.
Okay.
So that's why I was born in 46, and like I said, my uncle was killed in 45.
Right.
Okay. And another one on my dad's side was wounded while he was a Marine in the Pacific. And on my mom's side, I had a couple that served in Europe. One troop carrier command that he had nightmares about Market Garden. Mm-hmm. Because he had put together crews of several planes that went down during that. And the other one was a photographer for the Army, and he had some beautiful photographs. And unfortunately, for history, his daughter has not written back to me. I said those belong in a university library or Library of Congress, because he had beautiful black and white 8x10 photographs mm-hmm. of things in World War II that you don't see in books. And it's a big wood-bound volume. Mm-hmm. So it was one of those things that I'm really sorry didn't get out there someplace. I've always had an interest in history. Like you said, my heroes were guys that had served in World War II. I started reading about the Civil War. I read Bruce Catton, everything he wrote. He was a Michigan author, incidentally. And I've tried to expose students to history, reading sections of like this hallowed ground, to show them how beautifully the English language comes together and explains some of this stuff real clearly. Mm-hmm. So I've tried spreading history around ever since. Now, where do you want to jump to?
But we kind of go back here. So, okay, now did you go to high school in Muskegon?
I went to Glenside School for grade school. One of the teachers I had was Isabel Herbert, who's still alive, and I still go over and visit her at her nursing home about every 3 weeks. She was one that kind of encouraged me to go ahead and pursue just about anything I wanted to. If I got done with my assignment early and got up and got out of my seat and went back and grabbed an encyclopedia, that's fine. I wasn't bothering anybody to let one do that. So I probably read the section on World War II in the encyclopedia multiple times while I was in her class. And she also taught me a lot about science and nature, which I've enjoyed throughout my lifetime. In junior high, I went to Bunker. While I was at Bunker, I got involved in the band. Got to know people like William Stewart, Fred Royce. Fred Royce was a World War II vet who was also a POW. Unfortunately, he's passed away because his story was amazing. He was captured during the Battle of the Bulge, spent some time as a POW. One of the guys in his unit was Jewish, and his story about that whole thing was really very impressive. I also found out from talking to him that being in combat was going to change people forever. They didn't call it PTSD at the time, but after I got back from Vietnam, he and I had some long discussions on that particular topic. And but he was actually the high school band director until Carl Biergard came in. Now, Carl Biergard has been very active not only there, but at Western Michigan University with West Michigan Wind Ensemble, and then as an instructor at Blue Lakes Fine Arts Camp. I was in the drum section in both Bunker and Muskegon High. I played with Jerry Royce in the drum section. Jerry was later in the Air Force Band. Also, knowing Jerry Royce, I got down in the basement of their house, and I again got exposed to a little bit of post-traumatic stress disorder. I went down the basement, and I had never seen great big wooden cases of .30-06 ammunition before. And I mean, we're talking big wooden cases with handles so somebody can grab a hold of each end and carry them around, and loaded with boxes of ammo inside. And anyway, I found out that this did have some connection to a repeating nightmare that Fred had had about the Germans coming down this hallway at him, and he'd shoot him, and there were always more Germans. I'm thinking, okay, that makes sense that he might have about 5,000 or 6,000 rounds of .30-06 ammunition down the basement. But he unfortunately, like I said, has passed away, so we haven't got his stories anymore. Now, I mentioned that my heroes were World War II vets. Many of them were pilots. I decided I wanted to be a pilot. I applied for Air Force Academy as well as Michigan Tech. I'd been accepted to Michigan Tech, and I was also accepted I got a nomination for Air Force Academy, but when I went to take the physical, I failed the physical because of a fractured left leg from skiing that had not healed properly. And I'd taken a fall baseball tip right across the eyebrow, and I had a fracture there that apparently had somewhere along the line damaged some muscles, so that I didn't focus well, even with glasses. So I was, not allowed to go to Air Force Academy. Well, at Michigan Tech, I thought, well, what am I going to change to since I can't fly for the Air Force? And I thought, Smokey the Bear type forest ranger sounds real good. I could see myself as one of the historical guides at Gettysburg or at Yosemite or Yellowstone. That sounded real good to me. Except as I got along there, I found out that they were more interested in having their forestry students work for paper mills and cruise timber so they could make lots of money for the lumber companies. And I thought, I've grown up right near a paper mill, lakeside area. Don't want anything to do with paper mills.
Okay.
So I dropped.
Just to back up a moment here. When did you finish high school?
I graduated in 1964.
Okay.
64, 65, I was up at Michigan Tech.
Okay.
I started ski patrolling up there. I got involved in search and rescue up there. Was actually living where history took place because it was the copper country. I mean, I used to explore old abandoned towns and illegally explore some old abandoned mine shafts. A good friend of mine was a geology major, and we got into places we shouldn't have been. One time when I wasn't with them, all the climbing ropes were in my locker down in the sportsman's den. Now at that time at Michigan Tech, if you were a hunter, they had a place called the sportsman's den where you could keep your firearms locked up in there, and when you wanted to go out hunting, you'd come down, sign a little card, and put the card on the thing in the dorm there, and then you could take your firearm out hunting. Well, I also had climbing ropes in there, and the particular day that they went out and decided to explore some mine shafts, I was ski patrolling at another area, and they didn't ask my roommate for the key for my locker, and one of them slipped and fell and went about 150 feet down in one of the mine shafts on the ice. Well, they had to write a very apologetic letter in not only the school newspaper but the local newspaper for being there, because the county had to actually plow a road to the top of this mine shaft, and the Calumet Hecla mine rescue team had to get two of them out. Now, one guy had gone down to help the one that had fallen and gotten hurt, but he couldn't get himself back up, and the other guy had gone for help. Mm-hmm. And so some of those stories do abound, and one of the guys that was helping on that went for help was a guy whose dad had been a conservation officer, as well as an Air Force retiree. Mm-hmm. So he was an interesting guy to be around. Yeah. Now, when I dropped out of Michigan Tech.
So when did you leave Michigan Tech?
That would have been 1965. Okay. I was just there 1 year. Mm-hmm. I got very involved in ski patrol and search and rescue and stuff like that. And I like that type of thing. But I thought, well, I worked for a while at Quality Beverage here in Muskegon for a little while. And during that time, I realized the Army is kind of breathing down my neck, and I probably ought to decide how I'm going to deal with this military thing. And I thought, well, I want to be in a good unit. So I went ahead and signed up for Airborne Artillery, which really pleased the recruiter, because everybody wanted to sign up to be computer operators or something like that. No, I don't want to take the chance on getting in Vietnam and in some messy job, but I thought, well, if I end up in Vietnam, I'll at least be with a good unit. So I enlisted for Airborne Artillery.
Now, why did you select artillery as opposed to just...
Well, actually, the artillery probably goes back, that was what my uncle was in, that was killed in World War II. And one of the earliest pictures of me, my dad had plunked me down where I'm sitting, straddling the barrel of one of these 75 millimeter guns down here at the Veterans Memorial Park. Mm-hmm. I'm actually sitting there on top of the barrel of the firearm. I don't know where I was predestined I'd end up in artillery, but that sort of ended up that way. And also I figured that with all the mathematics experience I'd had at Michigan Tech, since it's primarily an engineering school, that it was not going to be hard learning any of the artillery jobs. So I signed up for Airborne Artillery, and during basic training they gave us a whole battery of tests. I really was too tired to do well on that, but I did surprisingly well. And they said, well, you can go to any school other than foreign language school.
Okay.
Somehow I got through high school without taking any foreign language.
Yeah.
So-
Now, we're going to back up a little bit. So, when do you actually sign up then? When do you enlist?
I enlisted in May of 1965.
Okay. And then, had you had a draft physical already, or do you go for physical after
I
you
went
enlist?
to Fort Wayne, down near Detroit. They did the physical, and from there, they loaded us directly onto buses, and we went down to Fort Knox, Kentucky.
Now, when they did the physical, did you tell them about your Air Force issues? Or?
No, I did not. I did not tell them I had anything wrong physically. You know, check on everything. I wanted to go into airborne, and I figured, you know, if they decide there's something wrong with me, they won't let me do that. So I sort of neglected to mention that.
Mhm.
Now, that caught me a little later on. Because in basic training I had scored real well on doing just about anything I wanted, and they decided I would make a good officer. Well, in order to become an officer, you got to get a secret clearance. One of the things the secret clearance turned up was the fact that I had been rejected for Air Force Academy for physical reasons, which I got grilled on quite heavily on that, on why I lied on my enlistment papers down at, and I said, well, I really want to serve my country, and I really want to serve in a good unit. And they said, well, unfortunately, we're putting you down as not qualified for artillery because, or for airborne because of the leg injury. I said, we'll still get you into artillery. And they said that we might even, you know, get you to OCS after a while. Well, I went through basic training.
Okay. Now let us talk about basic training. What was that experience like?
What?
Basic training.
Well, okay. Basic training I found was more hard psychologically than it was physically. I'd run cross country in high school. The physical stuff didn't really bother me. They made me acting sergeant for a while, and they gave me one guy by the name of Wing, who was a lot like in the movie Full Metal Jacket, you know, overweight, very much out of shape, and they said, you know, it's your responsibility to make sure this guy eventually passes the PT test. Well, Wing and I would go out every night after supper with his pet log. He would hold like this, and we would go jogging around the parade grounds. Well, when Wing got ready for the PT test at the end of the session, he could take his elbows like this and stick them down inside the pair of pants that he'd been issued, you know, when he first got to basic training. Well, he passed the PT test. I got congratulated for getting him through. And, you know, we did a bunch of marching. We were actually trained with the M14 rifle because that had just fairly recently replaced the M1 Garand as the Army's general rifle. And you know, I did fairly well with that, but I never felt real comfortable with it because I had a lot of jams and stuff. Well, part of the reason was because sometimes I had duty at the sawdust pit just before, where we beat each other around with the rifles, and you know, they got awfully dirty. And you know, I had rifles blow up on me. I had just all kinds of stuff. So I never really developed any particular confidence in the M14. And anyway, I got through basic training. My parents came down along with my sister to visit me, when I got out, and we did a tour of the Smoky Mountains. Now, one of the things, I'd practically grown up sort of like a water baby here in Great Lakes. My dad was a real good swimmer. Matter of fact, he'd rescued a girl that would have drowned in Duck Lake if he'd not jumped in and pulled her out. So he had me real comfortable with the Great Lakes and swimming. Well, anyway, we were at a swimming pool, and my sister, who was 3 years younger than I was, and I swam in the pool, and they said, well, you can't swim because you haven't got a lifeguard on duty, and after they watched us swim for a while, I guess you're probably okay. So they let us enjoy the pool there at the motel without an adult supervising, and we enjoyed that quite a bit.
Okay, so from basic, where do you go next?
Next one was Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which is home of the artillery. There I was trained primarily to work on gun sections, which would be the crew of an artillery piece. They trained us on the 105 millimeter, what was called the M101. It was a split-trailed 105 millimeter that was very common both in World War II and Korea. It was a fairly old piece of artillery, but it was relatively accurate, and the Army had lots of them. So anyway, we did advanced artillery training at Fort Sill. I did first aid there on a couple accidents where people had gotten hurt. The worst one was at night. We were firing, and one of the guys thought his particular artillery piece had already fired, and he stuck his arm up to catch the empty cases that ejected. It had not fired yet. It recoiled, and we're talking a major open fracture. I heard that he got a medical discharge out of the service because the arm was never going to work right after that. But I was the first one there to start first aid on him. They eventually got a medic. They had an ambulance there and took him away. But he never came back to our advanced individual training unit. Like I said, I understood he was given a medical discharge.
Now, how long was basic training? How long was AIT?
Basic was 8 weeks. AIT was also 8 weeks. And we would go out and fire the artillery pieces. And now on the gun crew, we didn't do any of the slide roll stuff that was done by fire direction control. But we were given the data to put on the guns and tell us how many mils we had to be up, what the azimuth was to our aiming stakes. And we'd go ahead and set those off on the guns, level the bubbles and everything. And the round would go 10 or 15 yards of where it was supposed to, someplace about 5 miles away.
Now, with the 105, can you adjust the charge on
Yes, the 105 was what was called a semi-fixed artillery piece. Now, that meant that it had the projectile and the case, and in the case there were 7 bags, and they were fastened together with a string. For instance, they might say charge 5. Well, we'd pull bags 6 and 7 out, drape them over the side. The section chief of the gun section would look to verify that we had, charge 5 and 6 and 7 were hanging on the outside, and then it'd, give us command, round approved, would push the thing down, so we'd cut the string and pass it on to a guy that would then go ahead and load the thing into the breech of the 105 millimeter howitzer. Now the 105 millimeter howitzer had a breech block that went side to side, and you'd put it in, the breech block would slam shut. Now other artillery pieces, like the one I worked on in Germany, that was what was called separate loading. That had a separate bag that had bags of powder that would be put into the breech after you wiped it down with a watery mop, so that sparks wouldn't set the stuff off. Because if you had sparks in there, when you put the powder bag in there, there was going to be this maybe 2,000 degree flamethrower that was going to go ahead and basically cook anybody's arm that was behind it. So, you know, you had to wipe the breech down after each round. And it had a primer that went in the back of the breech block. It looked about like a 38 special shell. And that was what started the thing. The last bag had a red pad on it. It was actually loaded with black powder that ignited real quick, and that would set the whole bunch of other bags off. Anyway, anything else you wanted to ask about AIT?
Yeah. I mean, how was AIT different from basic, just in terms of how you were treated or how you used your time?
Actually, there was less of the emotional harassment and a lot more training time as to what we were actually going to be doing. Now, advanced individual training would vary depending on what job you were going into. They were training me to work on gun crew. Mm-hmm. If I was being trained to fire direction control, they would have trained me on doing the slide rule type of thing. Or survey, which were the three major artillery skills that were taught. And then if you were a medic, they would of course give you training in that particular field. Now, you know, your first infantry division thing, there's a book that I'm reading now called Blood Trails, where the guy talks about, you know, his experience in basic training after he finished. You know, I said, well, I went down the line. Okay, you first 9 guys are gonna be medics, and he said this did not make him feel real good because these guys, you know, could have been trained as mechanics or whatever, and they were going to be putting somebody's body back together. But he was with 1st Infantry Division. In 1st Cav, we seemed to have people generally that, you know, were trained in that job.
Well, normally you did, to be a medic, they would send you for training. You didn't just magically become a medic.
Well, he describes the situation in the 1st Cav that, or the 1st Infantry Division, that some of the guys that were assigned jobs as medic were not actually trained in AIT as medics.
Oh, so they arrived with the unit, and then the unit just...
Yeah, then the unit went ahead and assigned them to someplace else.
Right.
Like in Germany, we had one guy that was, he'd been a multi-engine pilot, you know, had a license for multi-engine, and they assigned him to a gun crew, 5mm rounds, you know. It's like, okay.
But back to your story, I guess. Now, while you were in AIT, I mean, could you go off base when you were off duty? Or?
Yeah, I actually have more stories about Fort Sill, Oklahoma when I came back through there one time later on. We'll get to that, but yeah, I did do a little bit off base. Got into Lawton a couple times, but also I played drums for the battalion when the battalion marched anywhere. So if a battalion or company was doing something that Saturday morning, or, you know, I ended up playing drums for them to march them from. And our battalion commander was real pleased with that because we had a drummer that actually knew what he was doing. And yeah, I didn't get out and do a whole lot when I was in AIT.
All right. So after AIT, what happens next?
Then I came home for about a 2-week leave, and then went to Fort Dix, New Jersey. They decided to send me to Europe instead of Vietnam. Got on a plane, flew to Frankfurt, Rhine-Main Air Force based at Frankfurt, and then they gave me a train ticket to Nuremberg, and took the train down to Nuremberg, and I also had a little card on a phone number I was supposed to call when I got to the train station. And I remember the train station, it would just really impress me by the size of it in Nuremberg. Well, there was a deuce-and-a-half truck that came to pick me up after I made the phone call. And then things got real strange. The deuce-and-a-half took me to the south side of town, and there was a guy at the gate, you know, with a rifle and a guard post. And we went into this complex that looked more like a castle than an army barracks. I mean, I was used to the army barracks at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and Fort Sill, which were the leftover ones they built during World War II that were made out of wood and were probably built to last 10 years at most, and they were going to knock them down, but we were still using those. Well, here's this huge archway that we drove into, and the deuce-and-a-half stopped. And he says, well, this is where you get out. He said, you go out the rest of the way out this archway, and then you turn left. And he said, there'll be 2 quadrangles. And I said, are they painted on the ground? He says, no, quadrangle buildings. And I mean, these were areas that had about 1.5 blocks square inside this quadrangle. And the building is about 5 stories high and stone. And the archway that I'm standing in, I look up and lo and behold, here's all this inlaid stone all in the ceiling in these big, huge lights like you see on the inside of a church. And I'm thinking, it sure doesn't look like any army barracks I've ever been to before. And you know, I'm just kind of turning my head around like this, looking at it, thinking, now this is really kind of bizarre. But I grabbed my duffel bag and started walking out of this archway. As I got out of the archway, there was a big balcony overhead. And I couldn't see all the balcony, I was just looking at the bottom of it first. And I walked out to where the parade ground started, because that's where the road was, right along the edge of the parade ground. And I turned around and looked back, and all of a sudden, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I'd seen this place before. Matter of fact, I'd seen it watching Walter Cronkite in the program 20th Century. Except when Walter Cronkite was talking, Adolf Hitler was standing on that balcony like this, and there were half tracks full of SS troops running underneath it, you know, through this same road that I'd walked out to this left-hand turn road. And I thought, oh my goodness, I am now at a big SS barracks. And I'm thinking, okay, that is beginning to make a little sense now, because I could see pockmarks in the stone. Okay, yeah, this was here during World War II. It had been shot at and bombed some. And anyway, I followed instructions and walked up to the 3rd floor where Charlie Battery was, because I was being assigned to Charlie Battery, 2nd and 34th Artillery. And when I got up there, I set down my orders and introduced myself, and the person in charge said, okay, you're going to be assigned to, I think it was the 5th section, but anyway, he said, you can go ahead, there's bunks down there, and the wall lockers, and he said, you know, you can get a key for the wall locker and everything tomorrow. So I walked down there and I thought, yep, this is really strange for a barracks, because the hall I was walking through was about the width of a 2-lane highway, and it's polished stone floor. I'm thinking, I can see why these SS guys got the idea they could conquer the world, because you can imagine people goose-stepping down these hallways with a clack, 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 and I thought, yeah, this place was all built for the psychological effect too. And there were racks built into the wall where they used to keep firearms at one time. They didn't then, because, you know, that was from the old German days. And I walked into the room that I was assigned to, and as I walked through the room, the walls are about this thick, going from the hallway to the room, and I got in the room and looked out the window, and yeah, these walls are just about 3 feet thick stone. And, you know, wow. And anyway, I slept the first night there, and I immediately started, what can I find out about this place? And they wouldn't let us off base for the first 3 weeks. We had to go through what was Soviet Military Liaison Mission Training. Now, Soviet Military Liaison was a semi-legal, organized Russian spy group that it was supposed to drive certain cars with certain types of license plates that could go around and visit our military posts, but there were areas that they could not get into, and if they tried to get into them, they were supposed to be stopped and arrested and so forth. And also they told us about, you know, talking to people in, you know, civilians outside, about not saying anything about our unit because Cold War was on, and we didn't want the other side to know that our unit was only at about half strength. And I mean, we went through great pains to make it look like we had more people and more rank than we really did. Like later, well, when I was driving, when we went out on alerts outside military areas, I wore corporal stripes, even though I was only a PFC at the time, driving this 27-ton armor vehicle. I'd done real well on the driver's test, and they decided, okay, we'll start you in that job. And there was a guy that was really a Spec 4 that was wearing E6 stripes that was standing in the top of the turret of this thing. Now this 155 self-propelled, it looks like a tank, but it's got a bigger gun on it, and it doesn't have as much armor on it. Like a 50 caliber armor piercing round is going to come through that aluminum alloy armor and rattle around the inside for a while. But anyway, that is, except if it's on the front slope. And I thought, well, this is kind of nice because, you know, as a driver, I'm sort of behind the front slope. And anyway, it was one of those big, huge things that you'd think could go just about anywhere, but, you know, they'd tend to slide and stuff in the mud. And even worse was when winter came, we got ice on the cobblestones. Sometimes it got so bad you were sitting in a 27-ton hockey puck. And like the 2nd and 17th, it had 8-inch self-propelled. One time there was a little Volkswagen parked on the corner, and by the time the battery had gone over it, it looked like a bale of scrap metal. You know, it just, there wasn't much left of it except that sort of rectangular hunk of scrap that was ground clearance on the 8-inch howitzers. But like I said, I tried learning as much as I could about the barracks. I had probably only been there about 3 days when I asked one of the other guys who had been there for a while. He said, I asked him, I said, what's the castle like? And he says, the castle? I said, yeah, the castle on the other side of town. He said, you haven't been off base yet. How do you know about the castle? I said, well, you can see it from the roof. This guy, you know, eyes got about this big. The roof. How did you get up on the roof? And I managed to find a way I could get myself up on the roof, and I could see all across Nuremberg from up there. And also off on the, as I was looking towards the castle, off on the right is this big horseshoe-shaped building, which officially was known as Ostling's Roundabout, well, or Ostling's Round Building. If you read the Nazi stuff on, you know, that time period, it's called Congress Hall, and it's where Hitler planned on having the puppet rulers of the different countries, and he was going to stand at his little podium in the middle and give the orders of the day to all of these people. Well, the building is still there. There were still some places where there was bomb damage in the roof, but I found out later on that some of it was being used as storage, and some of it was being used as practice rooms for the Nuremberg Symphony Orchestra, where these masters would have other kids from the high schools and stuff, and would teach violin lessons and clarinet lessons and so forth inside of that building. So it was still being used for something, but I found out what its original intent was. Well, I could see part of a building beyond that. It was a long stadium type building with columns sticking up, and I couldn't see the center section of it real well, but I thought, could that be Zeppelinweiss? Well, after I was able to get a pass to go out there, I found out, yeah, it was Zeppelinweiss, which is where Hitler also would stand there with everybody, all the troops out in front and tanks out in front and so forth. And I'd also seen that on newsreels when it was totally intact, and I'd also seen newsreels when Patton's Third Army got there, because what they did, there was a big swastika surrounded by a wreath up on the top, and Patton had his demolition people from Third Army go ahead and blow that off. And of course, the newsreels took pictures of this big swastika and wreath tumbling off the roof of this building. Okay, that one's kind of interesting too. And after I had been there a while, I got a chance to actually go out to the castle and so forth, and I had enjoyed taking pictures, and I signed up for a photography class in the post. Well, the photography instructor had been a photography instructor, or he'd been a photographer for Signal, which was the German Army's magazine during World War II. He had made documentaries showing the German people that the American bombing really wasn't doing any real damage. He had pictures of a park that everybody knew in Berlin with German people having a picnic in this park. Of course, what you didn't know was that they had to have about a battalion of German soldiers moving in trees that actually had branches on them and planting them so that that's all you saw in the background, and you didn't see the ruined buildings and so forth. And he told me how they'd made the thing, and he says, yes, you can make photographs lie. And I used some of those techniques a little bit later on, like I had pictures of various historic buildings, including Fayette, which is a state park in the Upper Peninsula, when I was teaching school. And a kid said, do you ever go to any place that other people go to too? Because I never saw other tourists in my pictures. And I said, well, you see that old wooden well with the handle and the trough? I said, you notice I'm down at a fairly low angle. And I said, that trough is hiding a school bus. You know, so I'd use some of those angle things later on. But an interesting thing about him was that he had also done some movies and so forth in Nuremberg during the Nazi party rallies, as well as still pictures. And he gave me some of those still pictures and stuff later on. And I mentioned to him, I said, you know, our parade ground is cobblestone. I said, one side of it seems to develop frost and the other side doesn't early in the winter. And I said, any reason for that? And he wrote out a note in German and gave it to me. And he said, you know where the boiler works is? And I said, yeah. And he said, go down to the boiler works. And I says, it's got the name of a guy on the top, and he'll show you. So I went down to the boiler works. I couldn't speak much German. And this German guy goes and meets me at the door and has a steel beam lantern. And, motions for me to follow him. And we go through the boiler plant, and there's a tunnel that goes out. And I figured, yeah, this is pretty close to where the parade ground is. And I looked, and from this catwalk we were on, you could see the tails of ME-262 jets sticking out of the water. During World War II, we damaged their storm sewer system such that water got into a section of what had once been an aircraft assembly plant underneath their parade ground. And the Americans had tried to go ahead and get the water out of there, except the Germans had left booby traps. After they lost several demolitions experts, they decided to leave the storm sewer water down in there. So there's a whole bunch of what were at one time highly valuable historical ME-262 jets rusting away down underneath their parade ground. And he also showed me a couple other places where I could get underneath the buildings, and there were half tracks like that too, in underground storage areas that were partially underwater. And our barracks area was actually some places 3, some places 4 stories deep below ground. And we had special weapons things there where we had classes on nukes and nerve gases and so forth. But they had classrooms down there, and I was involved in a bunch of those because I did have a secret clearance. But one way to get the German taxi cab drivers a little angry if you were coming back into town was to say SS Kaserne. And they didn't like to be reminded that barracks had once been an SS barracks.
Now you mentioned getting a security clearance. What did you need that for?
Well, the thing is, they did that because they were going to send me to OCS at one time. Mm-hmm. And also, once I had the security clearance, they went ahead and upgraded things all the time so I could go to the special weapons classes and learn how to put together the detonating devices on nuclear warheads, which, you think, you mean the military actually turned loose this technology to 19 and 20-year-olds? And yes, they did. We had way too much responsibility for, what our job classifications were. And now to get into the particular area where these nuclear warheads were, there had to be an officer that had to open the thing up. But they made sure that they had one person out of every 2 gun sections that knew how to actually arm the warheads after they were in our vehicle if we got into World War III. And they had a place they referred to as the Fulda Gap, where they figured the East Germans and Russians would come through with large amounts of tanks and stuff, and we had some pre-planned targets on bridges and so forth there, and it was basically to slow them down until the family members of the troops and some of the civilians could get to ports and get out of there, because it was like you're just being sacrificed to hold them up for a couple 3 weeks, with your nukes and your artillery rounds, which I started doing the checking on, and I thought, now, according to the figures, we won't quite glow in the dark after we fire these things, because the range, even with the rocket-assisted projectiles, which, gave it more oomph than the Charge 7, which was the normal maximum load. They had what they called a wrap round, or a rocket-assisted projectile, and that they would kick it out farther. But we were still going to get some radiation from these things.
Not to mention whatever radiation you got from whatever came in.
Yeah, whatever was coming our way too. Yeah, it was one of those glow in the dark type of prospects that something went. And there were a couple incidents where things got pretty iffy. There was an American major that was killed that was part of the American liaison group that was shot by the Russians, and that caused an incident. The only incident that I was involved in got quieted down pretty quick. That was one where we were near the Czechoslovakian border. We were on a training exercise. We were, out there with our 155 self-propels and jeeps and trucks and so forth. And we got a call for help from one of the guard posts along the Czechoslovakian border. There were some people that were coming from east to west that had been shot at by the East Germans or Czechoslovakians, in one of the towers. There were some of them that were dead. There were some of them that were wounded. An American had gone out there and tried rescuing them. He had been shot and wounded, and these guys were asking for help. The battery executive officer, picked two vehicles, mine being one of them, and said, "Follow me." And we went to the border, and he immediately started yelling commands, target that tower. And we unhooked the travel locks and opened the breech block and cranked the barrel around. I said, "Sir, we haven't got any live ammunition for the main gun." He said, "They don't know that." And so we cranked the main gun around on the thing, and you never saw some people abandon their tower so fast in your life as those guys did, coming down when they saw this huge barrel swing around on them. But that was the only one of the border incidents that I was involved in. Like I said, the guys abandoned the tower. An armored personnel carrier went out along with the other vehicle that I was with, and since they had armor plate that at least stopped small arms on the 155 SP, and they went out there and picked up the people that had come across the border, and after about an hour and a half, 2 hours, some generals somewhere had gotten together and decided, okay, everybody be cool about this. And we went back, but...
Now, how long did you spend in Germany?
I spent just about 11 months there. Now, while I was in Germany, I also had a chance to do some things that were pretty unusual. One day I was in the NCO club and I was playing the piano, and pretty quick I'm surrounded by about a half dozen beautiful women who are singing Broadway show tunes as I'm playing the piano. And everybody's kind of looking at me, how do you do that? Well, it turned out that USO had sent these Miss America also-rans who were singers to do a variety show at various places around Europe. And that these women had showed up a little bit earlier, and they heard me playing Broadway show tunes, and they started singing them. Well, they passed the word on to somebody else who later on, mentioned that I knew how to play the piano, and the service club program got a hold of me and said, "We'd like you to play piano with the variety group the month of November 1965 in southern Germany." So for a whole month, I played piano with a jazz trio and a variety group that went around to various military bases in southern Germany, which is a real real step aside for a guy that's used to working on gun crews and big guns and big noises. And they asked about, we can get you orders cut where you stay here and do this type of thing. And I said, no. I signed up for artillery and go back to artillery. nice break. I enjoyed this, but I'll go back to my artillery unit. Well, I did, and then we got some replacements in. Now these guys, there's a 34th Artillery in Germany, 2nd and 34th Artillery, which I was in. Except there's also a 34th Signal Corps in Germany. Somebody did the wrong thing on a typewriter. There were about 40 guys that were supposed to go to 34th Signal to repair telephone lines. And they showed up at 34th Artillery. Now, like I mentioned, we were about half strength at that time. Our battalion commander was not about to let anybody know they goofed. So these guys end up getting moved into 34th Artillery. And in the section bay that I was in, there were 2 guys that were from this 34th Signal. And they came in and started asking about, well, where do we go to fix the lines? And I said, what are you talking about? And they said, well, we're phone linemen. And I said, this is an artillery unit. And they said, well, what are we going to do here? And I said, you just been assigned to a gun section. And they said, a gun section? What do you mean a gun section? And I said, well, we have this thing called a track. And they said, you mean like railroad tracks? No, this is a 27-ton armored vehicle that's tracked like a tank. And it has this big cannon on it. And they're totally aghast at this and can't figure anything out, like, well, what do they really look like? What is it like inside? What do you do in those? And I finally gave up and I went down and asked for a sergeant. I said, I've got these guys asking me all kinds of questions. And since I've been answering the questions, they keep asking more. And I said, it'd help if I could just show them what the thing looked like. So he calls down to the guardhouse and tells them that I'm bringing yay number of people down there. And I took one of the guys as a ground guide for me. And we went down there and I had the key, opened up the back of the thing, swung the doors open and shined a flashlight around and explained what all the different stuff was and, about the Pantel sight going where I said, well, what's it like when it moves? And I said, I'll tell you what, I'll just let 3 of you guys get in and I'll have somebody as a ground guide and I'll drive it around the motor pool. So the rest of them watched as I went ahead. Of course, this was winter months. Winter was just getting over at the time. And so I had to go ahead and turn on the preheater and stuff. We're talking about a great big huge diesel engine. And I went ahead and fired the thing up and it blew the white smoke for a while and then eventually it turned to black. And I went ahead and checked with the ground guide and that I was clear to go ahead and pull forward. And pulled forward, went around the motor pool and came back in. The guys had been shaking around a bit on the inside. But they thought this was really cool. This is a whole lot better than putting phone lines together. They thought this was neat. So about 2 days after that, our battalion commander says, okay, we're going to train all these guys as artillerymen. Now these guys have not been through artillery AIT, they've been through commo AIT to fix phone lines. And so he assigned me to the training group that would go ahead and teach these guys the skills of artillery. So I taught them how to cut charges and the loading procedure for getting the rounds into the vehicle and what different jobs that they would do. We didn't put them on the gunner's slot or assistant gunner's slot or the driver's slot at the time because those were kind of important. We want people that really knew what they were doing there, but we used them in, to go ahead and cut charges. I showed them how to cut the time fuses and stuff like that. And, make sure everything was right there. And anyway, about 3 or 4 weeks later, somebody found out that these guys had been shipped to the wrong place. And most of them decided they wanted to stay with us instead of go to the 34th Signal, because this was a whole lot more interesting. And you know, the idea that at dark 30 in the morning we might go out on an alert someplace in this big armored vehicle and go wailing down this gravel road out in the middle of nowhere and pull up, and then you'd watch daylight come and you're overlooking this field of hops and stuff for, you know, making beer and so forth. And you know, they've got all the data set on the guns, and yep, if this had actually turned into World War III, we would be firing right now. And you know, we would have those types of alerts, and they were kind of fascinated by that. And then we went to a place called Grafenwehr. Grafenwehr is a field training area that is, the Germans had fired artillery back there in the 1800s. So there's a bunch of duds laying around, a bunch of smashed up stuff laying all over the place. And also there was a saying about Grafenwehr that Grafenwehr is the only place that you can run into so much dust that you won't see the mud hole that's going to swallow your vehicle. And it was just about that bad. You know, like I said, it was all chewed up by artillery fire and armored vehicles just charging all over it for years and years and years. Well, they got a chance to actually fire the artillery pieces at Grafenwehr. One time there was what they call a target acquisition battery. And the target acquisition battery is one that uses radar to figure out where the enemy shells are coming from.
Okay, I'm going to pause right here because take number one is just about out. So we get a break. All right, we're back for hour number 2 with Glenn Sheathelm. So.
Okay, this was actually my 3rd trip to Grafenwehr when we were training these new guys. First trip was during midwinter, and when you're dealing with 27-ton armored vehicles, you quickly learn you don't grab anything without mittens on, because your skin's going to peel right off. We had tents that we actually slept in that were on concrete slabs. They were heated by coal stoves, and sometimes the coal stoves didn't burn real well. Well, we found that a little bit of diesel fuel would blow the soot out so that they would breathe a little bit better, and that worked pretty good. Except one day one of the guys went to the wrong 55-gallon drum to fill up his coffee can with what he thought was diesel fuel. It was aviation gas. He came back to the coal stove, started pouring it in. Flames jumped up to the coffee can he was holding. Of course, he let go of that, which then hit the floor. And so we got burning gas all over the floor of the inside of this GP medium tent. We're talking about a tent maybe 16 or 18 feet wide by maybe 30 feet long. And anyway, we got flames, and of course there was one of the guys that was real anxious to get out of his sleeping bag, and his zipper ripped and he jumped out of it, and then his sleeping bag caught fire, and it just kind of exploded into this little bunch of sparklers. Everybody was real anxious to get out of their sleeping bags and out. And I remember you know, exiting underneath the sidewall of the tent and scraping myself all up as I crawled on the concrete because the smoke was so bad I couldn't really see exactly where the end of the tent was. Now this GP medium tent has 2 tent poles, and I one part way down towards each end. They're probably, about that big. And one of the guys in the process of heading for the doorway ran smack dab into one of those tent poles, and he knocked himself out. And I found out that you know, they thought he'd run into a tent pole. I got down low, grabbed a hold of him, pulled him the rest of the way out. He was really scraped up bad after I dragged him across the concrete. But anyway, that was one of our excitements during that winter maneuver. The other time we'd gone there and fired 105 millimeter howitzers because this target acquisition unit used radar to track the rounds, had ordered the wrong kind of ammunition for us. And I knew how to run a 105 as well as a 155. So I got picked to be part of the crew on that. And we went out and shot the 155 so they could figure out where we were shooting from and track the thing back. So I'd been at Grafenwehr several times. It was exciting, but always dusty and dirty. I mentioned about having pictures. I got one picture where I looked like a Mexican bandit and got, hair and goggles and nothing but just covered with dust. And I'm standing up next to the driver, in the driver's compartment, and gives people an idea of how bad the dust really was out there. And we also, like I said, ran some field problems where we were actually out in the German countryside.
Go back to the Grafenwehr for a minute.
Yeah.
You mentioned there was a lot of unexploded ordnance out there.
Yeah.
Were you driving right over it?
They usually had little red flags. Now sometimes we drove over stuff without realizing we were going over it. But when they found this stuff, they would put little red flags, and we'd go around it until they had an EOD team come blow it up. But we undoubtedly ran over some old stuff somewhere along the line.
Okay. But as far as you know, there weren't any incidents where anything blew up?
No, I can't actually say that, because there were incidents where people were injured, going ahead and digging out an old mortar round with their entrenching tool to dig a foxhole. And where there were people injured. Now, there was one incident too. It was what we call an artillery incident, and involved an investigation. Didn't involve our unit in any way, either on the receiving end or the sending end, but there's a thing called an aiming circle. It looks sort of like a surveyor's transit, but it can be set up 3,200 mils out or 180 degrees wrong. So the lieutenant who sets this up, or chief of smoke, which is chief of firing battery, is responsible for checking to make sure which direction he's actually got this thing oriented. Well, it turned out that there was some first lieutenant somewhere who hadn't done that. And the 8-inch were set up to fire the wrong way. The lanyard was jerked, and there were immediate radio calls that, Grafenwehr, 9er, ceasefire immediately. So in other words, anybody firing anything on a whole post to Grafenwehr, 9er means everybody stop shooting. And then they figured out what had happened. And I've never seen so much brass investigating an artillery incident as that one, because an 8-inch round is, almost 200 pounds of steel and explosive. And it landed in a mess hall. Fortunately, there was nobody in there other than a couple KPs and a cook at the time. It would have been a major disaster if the unit had been in there for lunch or something at the time. But there was lots of brass around investigating that. And later, when I got to Vietnam, there was a officer that was a forward observer that had been safety officer for another unit earlier, and I never ran into anybody so cautious about what he was doing. And but like I said, we were at Grafenwehr several times now. One of the field problems we did in the countryside, our battery was set up, and they sent me out with the sergeant and one other guy who was a radio operator for the group. And we were supposed to do a recon on some road junctions that were a distance away. Well, it turns out that the aggressor who was actually the third Infantry Division. That's the same one that Audie Murphy was in during World War II. They had blue and white stripes on their vehicles. And anyway, they chased our battery away. So here I am, I haven't got radio communication with anybody because they're too far away. And I don't know where we're supposed to go, and the sergeant doesn't know where we're supposed to go either. We're outside of a little town called Firth, which is outside of Nuremberg. And from the map, I knew, where we were and everything and what road we were on. But I couldn't tell anybody because I couldn't reach anybody that was on our side on the radio. So we sat there for a while, and eventually there's this Jeep that comes down the road underneath this overpass. And just as he gets out of the overpass, he stops, and there's this lieutenant in the front seat. He's looking at his map. I thought, they're the bad guys in this field problem. Whispered to the sergeant, why don't we just capture them in their Jeep? We did. And now what do? Well, we don't really know exactly what we're going to do, but we know where we are. So, they had me navigate us back to where our barracks was in Nuremberg, where we turned these three guys over. And we missed the last 2 days of the field problem because we're in Nuremberg with these guys that we captured, And so the field problem ended right there. Now, while that field problem was going on, a guy by the name of Johnny Rodgers, who had been my section chief, and I'd worked with him as far as getting ready for the 7th Army gunnery test, which, is one of the things that identifies some of the top people in gunnery in the whole 7th Army. And he did very, very well on that. Like I said, I'd worked with him with the test target and stuff, so he was doing a lot of stuff real fast, including laying the battery. And, sometimes we'd use my artillery piece, sometimes I'd just use, wooden stakes and mark them where the site was, and you'd go ahead and lay the stuff from there. But anyway, he got a lot of practice and did real well on the test. Johnny Rodgers was an E6. We had 2 E7s and an E8 in our battery. Johnny Rodgers got appointed Chief of Smoke, or Chief of Firing Battery, which is the most important job in a firing battery. The lieutenants and captains may think they run the show, but it's Chief of Smoke that, if he's good, he can run the whole show by himself. Well, it turns out that one of these guys that outranked him and also had a lot of time in grade was very anti-black. Johnny Rodgers was black. I don't know whether he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan or just knew where there was a Ku Klux Klan cell in Second Armored Cavalry Regiment, which was also stationed at Merle Barracks in Nuremberg. But anyway, I was out running around the parade field one night, and I noticed 8 guys grabbed a hold of a vehicle and flipped it over outside of the NCO club. And I ran after them and yelled for the guard as I was doing so. And they broke up because they knew I couldn't chase all of them at one time. And one of the guys ran into one of the barracks areas that I knew pretty well. He apparently didn't know it real well, and didn't realize that he was going to run into a dead end and was going to have to come back to the stairway. Well, he came back towards the stairway, and I tackled him just as he was starting up. And both of us went down, and he came out with a switchblade. And I was about ready to go ahead and put a foot into the side of his head, and I hear this shunk of an M14 bolt closing behind me. Everybody be nice. So I stopped, and the guard asked me what was going on, and I mentioned about this vehicle being flipped over, and he says, yeah, I'm aware of that. And I said, this guy was one of the guys flipping it over. I said I wasn't able to chase down the other guys, but this guy was definitely one of them. So anyway, they took him away, and a little bit later on, there was an officer from Second Enlisted Student Battery, or Second Armored Cav, that tried to get me to change my story. And I said, no. Well, about that time, I found out that the vehicle also belonged to Johnny Rodgers. And Johnny Rodgers had his wife and 2 kids in Germany. And he didn't want to make a real big fuss because he was worried about the Klan coming after his family. I had a couple of Klansmen try to get to me. Like I said, this was after we'd come back from a field problem once. I was down at the wash rack, and I'd taken the 155 howitzer down there, and used the hose and was spraying it off and getting the mud and stuff off of it. And I saw these 2 guys coming towards me that looked like they were up to no good. And so I went to the back of the vehicle and reached in and grabbed a pickaxe handle. Well, one of these guys came at me with his switchblade out. I promptly broke his wrist, and the other guy ran away. There was some concern that I was sort of a loose cannon around the area, and so I got shipped back to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and I thought I was going to go to gunnery instructor school.
So when was this that you go to Fort Sill now?
This was in the late summer of 1966, and anyway, I was sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and thinking I was going to go to gunnery instructor school because I'd applied for that, and I'd canceled my application for officer candidate school, because this time I'd gone to officer candidate school. It would have been another year in the service. I thought, no, without a college degree, it's not really a good job to go to OCS, because you're going to make maybe captain before they rift you out if you survive that long. And I thought, well, if I'm going to become an officer, I might make a career out of it. Well, I thought, I got to get the college degree first. So I told them no, I didn't want to go to OCS. They said, well, if you don't go to OCS, you're going to go to Vietnam. I said, okay, your point is, since all these crispy new second lieutenants are going to go to Vietnam as artillery forward observers, I'll take my chances. So they sent me to a place called Second Enlisted Student Battery, which was on main post.
Okay. Now, I do want to pause here and back up a little bit.
Okay.
There's some other aspects of Germany. A part of it is, while you were in Germany, did you pay much attention to what was happening in Vietnam or anything like that, or were you just focused on?
Yeah, I did pay some attention on, and at Stars and Stripes magazine, I saw a picture of a guy by the last name is Scanlon, standing on top of a enemy bunker with a captured weapon. He'd been in basic training with me, and but my view of Vietnam at that time was, if we wanted to fight communism, we could have gone a short distance off of our coast and gone to Cuba. Why this big fuss about communism halfway around the world? It's like, I'm not sure this is really a logical war to be involved in because of the distance and supply problems. It was halfway around the world. Most of the people in the United States didn't even know where Vietnam was. They knew where Cuba was. It was just off the coast of Florida. It seemed like, why the big fuss about why we have to go to Vietnam? I had read some about Vietnam when I was in Germany, but not a lot. I did most of my reading about Vietnam when I was at Fort Sill at Second Enlisted Student Battery.
All right. And then the other thing about Germany is, how did the German civilians seem to view the American soldiers?
Generally pretty good, except for the ones where American soldiers had gone to bars and gotten in fights and so forth. But I found Germans quite willing to show me around in Germany to some of the churches. One night in the Nazi Party rally area, I'd gone into one of these places, entrance verboten or forbidden. It was a big tower. There were a whole bunch of big towers. They surrounded an area about 3/4 of a mile on a side called Marsfeld, and which stands for marching field really. But it was supposed to be a place where Hitler was going to raise the next master race, complete with big beams over the top and a little bit. This would have dwarfed the Super Bowl type of buildings, but the building never got completed. There was bomb damage to it, and Hitler had other things to do with any manpower, including slave manpower that he'd used for that. Well, one of these towers that was pretty close to completed was being used for a rotating beacon for the airport for the military, which was actually inside of this Marsfeld area. They didn't have big planes in there. They had, like Beavers and Otters and some helicopters. They were basically light observation planes and, hacks and stuff for Army officers. There was the equivalent of a Beech 18 that was there, which was a twin engine thing, but I think the largest plane I ever saw inside of there was a C-7 Caribou, which is a short takeoff and landing cargo plane that was used quite a bit in Vietnam. But anyway, I was in the tower right next to that, and I'd gone up to the top, and I was just sitting there and admiring the scenery, and I heard this bunch of footsteps or a set of footsteps on the stairways and stuff coming around the inside of this tower, and I thought, sure hope that's not a policeman. It was his dog. And I thought, how am I going to explain this? And I thought, well, I can always play super dumb. So anyway, the guy comes out. It's not a policeman. It's a guy that's, what do you call him, a youth hosteling, college student around Germany. And he's got his guitar with him. And he opens up his guitar case, and he's sitting up there, and I'm looking at him, and in the background is this Zeppelinwiese, this place where Hitler at one time had all of his troops lined up, and that's probably a mile and a quarter away, but I can see it off there in the distance because it's just a huge building. And he gets out his guitar, and he's singing this song, "Where have all the flowers gone, long time passing, young girls have picked them, everyone. Young girls have gone to young men, everyone. Where have all the young men gone to soldiers, everyone," and anyway, he's singing the song up there on the top of this big tower. I'm thinking, how appropriate. Here's this anti-war Peter, Paul, and Mary, I believe, song that he's singing on top of this, and he's singing it in German. And I thought, gee, this is kind of weird. And I listened to him for a while, and then it was getting close to sunset, so I went over and shook hands with him and said good Abend or good evening, and walked down. But that was one of those encounters with one of the German civilians. Now there were occasionally some that were really kind of uptight about getting their pictures taken. They possibly might have been involved with the SS at some time during World War II, and figured that I might have been with Mossad, which was the Israeli secret police that sometimes wrapped people in blankets and flew them to Israel. But there were some Germans that were kind of fearful of that. I remember one time coming back on the streetcar, I got a picture of a young girl. She's you know, standing by the front of the streetcar. She's got a balloon. She's been to a friend's birthday someplace. But it was, you know, so I got some neat pictures of some civilians, but I generally avoided taking pictures of civilians as much as possible because I knew some of them were kind of uptight about it, you know. We didn't seem to have any real hostility, and some of them were very appreciative of the American soldiers because some of them remembered the Berlin airlift, and you know, so they were real positive about some things like that too.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
All right. Now we can take you back to Fort Sill, where you've gone in now, having been sent back from Germany. So
Yeah.
pick up the story there.
Okay, anyway, they said, well, you know, you sure you don't want to go to OCS? And I said, no. So they sent me to a place called Second Enlisted Student Battery. That was on main post. Second Enlisted Student Battery was several stories high. It had balconies on the back that overlooked the parking lot. My job there was to pull CQ or charge of quarters every other night, which meant I was sort of like the babysitter for roughly 200 guys. You know, making sure they got tucked into bed, signing for guys that the MPs brought back, and, you know, taking all the paperwork and putting it in the right file cabinet drawer for the first sergeant to deal with in the morning, you know, when he got back in. So that was my job. Now that was only an every other night thing. The rest of my time was free. Well, I went ahead and went over to the pistol range and shot every day, usually twice. I spent a lot of time in the library figuring I'm going to go to Vietnam, I better learn a whole bunch about that. So I started reading everything I could on Vietnam. I started reading sometimes some confidential reports that, you know, since I had a secret clearance, they let me back in that room and let me read some of these reports of earlier battles that were, you know, still appropriately stamped. And anyway, the time came for me to go to Vietnam, and I got another couple weeks leave back home, and reported to Oakland Army Terminal.
You'd mentioned before when we talked about Fort Sill, and I asked about going off base and things like that, and you said you well, the story for that later on.
Okay, the thing is, I didn't spend a lot of time off base, but there was one guy from Second Enlisted Student Battery, who's what is known as an OCS casual. Now these guys in OCS casual were guys that had been in OCS for anywhere between 3 weeks and about 4 months. The Army said, can't make you into an officer. And they turned them loose. Now you have to remember OCS beats you down to absolutely nothing. I mean, you know, like in the movie Lower the Snake Shit type of thing. And anyway, these guys had never been built up to where they really had any self-confidence or self-worth at all. There were guys that walked out in front of trucks on purpose to get killed. There was one guy that I heard the stuff on the loudspeaker system. There was an incident going on up, you know, talk about privacy. I mean, in the Army, you don't have that. I mean, I could flip to different bays and listen in on what was going on all over Second Enlisted, and I heard the confusion up in one bay, and I got on the PA and I said, "What's going on?" They said, "Well, we got a guy from the OCS casuals that's got a bayonet that he got from someplace, and he's threatening to jump off the balcony into the parking lot." So I grabbed one guy that was playing pool in the room next door. I said, "Come on with me," and we ran upstairs to where this room was, and lo and behold, the guy was out there on the balcony, and he was threatening to jump off. And he says, "I'll kill anybody that tries to stop me." I grabbed an army blanket off one of the bunks and went at him like a bullfighter, got his bayonet followed up in that, and 3 of us jumped on him and held him until the MPs and the guys with the straitjacket came to take him away, and they actually did. Now, this was not an American bayonet, it was one that he got at some surplus store in town. And that's how he happened to come upon that bayonet that, you know, we caught him with upstairs threatening to jump off into the parking lot. And it was a few days after that that I got orders that I was going to go home and then report to Oakland.
Now, were any of these OCS casuals people who maybe had flunked out of OCS intentionally? Stall?
Some of them may have, yep. Now, there was one guy that came out of OCS. He'd only been there 2 days. The guy had a degree in geological engineering. He worked for Sunoco Oil Company prior to getting drafted. And he saw what was going on with this breaking everybody down to nothing in OCS. And he said, I spent too much money on my brain. They're not going to screw with me. So he purposely started screwing with them, purposely doing everything wrong. Like, you know, when an upperclassman told him, you know, you don't do anything until I tell you to. Well, this upperclassman gets caught by another upperclassman, and this guy went ahead and marched his troops right through the flower garden and smack into the side of the building. And, you know, he kept doing things like that, and after about 3 days, he basically told one of the officers, he said, you know, you try screwing with my mind, I'm going to screw with your program. And they let him go. And he was somebody I could talk to pretty well over the OCS casual thing. But there were some of those guys that were mentally gone. They should have had some real severe psychological counseling before they got turned loose. I can't, you know, some of those guys, I can't imagine that they ever did anything productive in their lives afterwards. But
all right. So another digression there. So you're going back now. So we're now headed to Vietnam. We've gotten you as far as Oakland. Was that the depot that you flew out of? Or?
Yep. Now at Oakland, one of the things that we did there, we went to donate blood for the city of San Francisco because once we started taking the anti-malarial meds, they couldn't take our blood at the blood collection center. Well, that was my first real encounter with anti-war crew. They were throwing stuff at us. We were baby killers and all this other stuff, and I'm thinking, hey, we are donating blood to your city and to people who need blood in your city, and we are the bad guys. You know, there's something wrong with this whole picture. Well, my picture of California hasn't much improved, you know, over the years. It's like there's an awful lot of people that maybe if the next earthquake dropped California off into the Pacific Ocean, we might be better off. Yes. But because we encountered the same thing when we came back after Vietnam.
Now this time when you're at Oakland, so where did you encounter the protesters? Was it at?
That was right downtown in San Francisco at the blood collection center.
Okay. So they knew you were going to be there?
Oh yeah, they knew that, you know, like the Army was bringing guys in, and it was probably 3 or 4 busloads a day that the Army brought over there to donate blood. And, you know, the Army buses rolled up and they were already angry with us and throwing things at us, and, you know, the baby killer signs and the whole bit. And I'm thinking, why? I mean, we're trying to do something for your community, and we're the bad guys, you know. But did you want to go from there to the flight over, or where do you want to go next?
No, yeah, I mean, and if we've
Okay.
It's how long did you spend in Oakland?
I was there probably about 5 days.
Okay. And aside from going and giving blood, how did you spend your time?
They had us walking around the post, if you can pick it up, police call, that kind of stuff. If you can't pick it up, paint it white, types of things. And a lot of times we, spent time reading or just sitting in our bunks. And then they had a thing where they had the flight calls, and they called my name off, and we went out to the Air Force terminal, and we slept in a big hangar in bunks. They didn't have any bedding or anything on them. We just laid there on the bunks, and I didn't sleep real well that night, because I knew where I was going. I knew I would probably go to a gun crew someplace. I'd read about artillery fire bases being attacked and the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong coming through the wire. And those types of thoughts were in mind, so I just didn't sleep real well. And I got out and was standing in kind of like a porch area outside the side of the hangar. And I'm looking, and there's this tractor coming down the taxiway. And the tractor is pulling these wagons that are loaded with coffins. They're sneaking all these dead Americans back in the middle of the night. Does anybody know that this is going on and that there are this many Americans coming back every night? Because I'd heard the tractors go by, but had never paid much attention to it until I went out that one time, and yeah, there are wagons full of coffins coming back from Vietnam. And so, I was thinking, yeah, this is going to be pretty tough here. So,
when is this now chronologically?
that would be the fall of '66. Probably 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. We had actually combination Christmas and Thanksgiving at my parents' house the week before I reported to Oakland, because they wanted me to get a chance to see the relatives before I went. So my mom had basically everybody over from, for the relatives. We had a Thanksgiving dinner a couple weeks early. Mm-hmm. So I finally got a call for a flight and so forth, and we stopped at Hawaii, but I can't say I saw anything of Hawaii, because we got off the airplane and walked around in this fenced enclosure, and they wouldn't let us go anywhere. We got a chance to stretch our legs, but that was about it. Mm-hmm. Got back on the plane and then flew to the island of Guam, where planes were taking off to bomb Vietnam already from there. We saw B-52s, we saw B-47s. Some of them we could see bombs hanging from the bottoms. We knew they were probably not heading towards Vietnam empty. Anyway, they got us back on the plane, and we were supposed to land at Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Vietnam, which is right near Saigon. And the pilot says, we will have a slight delay before we land. He said, there's a firefight going on one side of Tan Son Nhut, and the artillery battery is on the other. And he says, I don't like sharing airspace with artillery rounds, so we're going to wait a while until they're done shooting. And I'm looking down at the Saigon River and the mud and the little boats in the river, and I'm thinking, awfully long year, Well, we landed at Tan Son Nhut, and they put us in some barracks that were right there at the air base for that first night. Now, these had mosquito nets on them. They didn't have any mattresses on them, so the mosquitoes come up from the bottom. Anyway, we were still in our Class B uniforms, the khaki at the time. And then the next day they put us on a bus, and I noticed, okay, the bus has got screens on the windows, heavy screens, and somebody asked the bus driver, why are the screens on the window? Well, that's so Viet Cong doesn't throw a hand grenade into the bus. Okay, I'm not even to a base yet. I haven't been issued a weapon yet, and they're already talking about how the Viet Cong can do me in, and I thought, not good. And I also saw a lot of refugees along the road. Now, some of these refugees were sleeping in the wax-coated cardboard shipping boxes. That was their house, you know. A family was living in a box a little smaller than the bathroom down the hall here. And sometimes there were people who had died that were just lying along the road that other people were walking around. And it was, you know, a different world than I'd ever been exposed to before. From there we went to a place called Long Binh, which was where 90th Replacement Depot was located. Now at 90th Replacement Depot, I got there just, I'd been assigned to Vietnam, but no particular unit yet. At 90th Replacement Depot was where they assigned me to a unit. I fully expected to go to the 1st Infantry Division because they had 155 self-propels, and I was, I had, you know, all my records showed I was an expert gunner on a 155 SP. It only seemed like they'd put me in the job that I was probably best trained at. And after a few days, they called me. Now, 90th Replacement Depot, I noticed they had the wooden boxes. It said poison on the outside. There were yellow boxes, and probably 3/4 of an inch thick wood on the side. And I found out that they were rat poison boxes. The rats would get the rat poison out of there. And I noticed there was some kind of scummy water around. And I also noticed that there were some Vietnamese that were using like a big hand drill holes for bolts to build barracks, you know, because some places they had barracks, some places the replacements were still in tents. And 90th Replacement continued getting bigger and bigger as things got on. Well, they eventually called my name that I was supposed to go to the 1st Cavalry Division. And I went to the office and I said, "You sure that isn't 1st Infantry Division?" He said, "1st Cavalry Division doesn't have any 155 self-propels." And they said, "No, but we've looked at your scores and they want somebody with your capability. You'll be trained up there." And I thought, oh, geez. I had seen, just before I went to Oakland, I'd seen a program called Saga of Western Man on television. And they had a program on that called I Am a Soldier. And it dealt with the A Company, 1st Battalion, 8th Cavalry, and a company commander by the name of Ted Danielson. And I watched those and I thought, well, at least, you know, if I'm going to 1st Cavalry Division, I could end up like a unit like that, which is a real straight unit. I mean, it's not what I've been trained for, but that's a real straight unit. And I kind of filed that, you know, in the back of my mind. And also during that time period, I read a 1965 National Geographic article on the Special Forces in Vietnam. And they had quite a bit about a Major Vernon Gillespie, who, well, actually at that time he was a captain. But this Vernon Gillespie was quite influential in ending the 1964 Montagnard Revolt. I had a lot of pictures of him National Geographic. They'd been photographed in several other places. Well, I didn't know that this Ted Danielson and Vernon Gillespie were people I was going to cross paths with later on. And along with some of the other guys that showed with Ted Danielson from his A Company, 1st the 8th. But, you know, this was kind of in the back of my mind. And I thought, well, you know, it might not be a bad assignment anyway. So they put me on a C-130 and flew me up to Ankei, which was the headquarters of the 1st Cavalry Division at that time. Now, 1st Cavalry Division had gone over there in 1965. They'd been there a year already when I got there. The commander of the 1st Cavalry Division when they went over was Harry W. O. Kennard. Harry W. O. Kennard was well known in some of my former reading, particularly about the Battle of the Bulge. Harry W. O. Kennard was the operations officer for McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division. So I was familiar with the name Harry W. O. Kennard and so forth. And there also, during that first year, they had some rather unusual battalion commanders that went over there. One was a guy by the name of John Stockton. John Stockton later on wrote a book called A Cavalryman's Life. Actually, his wife finished it up after he died at McGill University Hospital in Toronto, Canada. And anyway, John Stockton had been a young lieutenant during World War II. He had been involved in, you know, the final few months before Germany fell, and he mentions a number of incidents in his book, The Cavalryman's Trade, about, you know, his time in that. But he commanded 1st the 9th. Now, Stockton was a rather unusual personality. While they were at Fort Benning, Georgia, he went ahead and bought a mule and decided the mule was going to be their mascot for 1st the 9th. And it was going to go to Vietnam with them. Well, it was put on the boat. The Navy threatened to stamp it property, you know, branded property of the United States Navy. So he had a guard put on it. And they went to Vietnam like that. Stockton was not too aware of how they were going to land in Vietnam. He had heard that they were going to make a beach landing. And so he went to the captain and asked to see, you know, their landing nets. He wanted to go ahead and inspect everything. Captain had not even been informed where he was going at that time. He's getting this story about landing nets and people going over the side of his boat in landing nets, and a lot of confusion here. Well, eventually they get to Vietnam, and it turns out that there are civilians as well as officers greeting them as the boats pull into Vietnam, a place called Quinh Nham along the central coastline. It had been used as a base by the Japanese during World War II. And, you know, it had a nice harbor and stuff. Well, they unloaded there. John Stockton's mule was taken off, but he gets this letter from Kennard, or notice from Kennard, that the mule is not to set foot on the ramp of one of the helicopters. Kennard wants this mule to basically stay in Quinh Nham and doesn't go to base camp at Ankei. Well, Brigadier General Knowles points up and taps Kennard on the shoulder, and here's this mule. It's in a sling underneath the helicopter and going by. Of course, Kennard was kind of irked at this situation. Stockton got to Vietnam. The first parade that they had When they got to Quin Yon, Stockton has got his mule out. Stockton is wearing his black cavalry hat and a saber, and leading this mule. It's got a pack on the back with two 12-volt batteries powering this rotating beacon that's supposed to be on the back of a helicopter. Kennard is not at all pleased with Stockton's behavior on all this stuff, and Stockton was one of the two guys that, if you saw the movie Apocalypse Now, the crazy colonel there, played by Robert Duvall. Well, Stockton was one of the two guys they actually used for the model for that character. The other one was James Smith, who was also later on brigade commander, but he was a general. Smith had a photographic memory, but Smith used to go down in his helicopter and shoot up at snipers in the trees. He was that type of person. They also sometimes referred to him as Sniper Smith, because when he was battalion commander and then he was in the command helicopter, which was a Huey, he carried an M1 Garand. And if there was a Viet Cong running down there all alone, he had the helicopter get to a position and hold it as still as he could, and he'd flick the guy with this M1 Garand out of the helicopter. So some of the guys referred to him as Sniper Smith, other ones referred to him as Crazy James. But he was a good, straight officer. Now, Stockton, you've seen the movie We Were Soldiers. Actually, that was a couple of later battles. There were a few battles that actually took place before that. One was called the Mirror River, the Tay River, Hospital Complex, and LZ Mary. All four of those were not as big as the ones they showed in the movie We Were Soldiers, but there were still some fairly significant battles. Stockton played a part in the one at LZ Mary because it was his battalion that had the company from 1st to 9th that attacked what they thought was a North Vietnamese platoon. It turned out to be the lead element of a North Vietnamese battalion, which probably came chasing after Stockton's platoon, which assembled with the rest of the guys from the company on a small hilltop. They got the name LZ Mary, and Stockton went ahead and decided that he was going to reinforce LZ Mary at night, which had never been done by helicopter before, in the middle of a battle, reinforcing the things at night. But he went ahead and made plans for this. The unit that was supposed to reaction force was A Company, 1st the 8th, which is the one commanded by this Ted Danielson. And they went in by helicopter at night, since the landing lights, or the normal navigation lights, made the helicopters too much for a target. They had infantrymen put the angle head flashlights down on the deck so that they could only be seen by helicopters at the same altitude. And they managed to go in without tangling blades together and dropping off A Company, 1st the 8th. One of them was a guy by the name of John Hanlon, who I met later on again, but he was shot in the spine and paralyzed. His platoon sergeant was a guy by the name of Ken Revere, who took over the platoon, and they managed to hold the thing during the night. Some other guys were like Earl Waters and so forth, that were guys that I got to know later on real well that were in on that. And Earl Waters, if you've ever seen the documentary Shadow of the Blade, about this helicopter that was fixed up, and they went and visited Vietnam vets before it went to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., but its last stop on the flight was Angel Fire, New Mexico, where they have that chapel that is now actually a state historical park run by the state of New Mexico. But anyway, these guys went ahead and fought the battle, and the North Vietnamese backed off because they realized once daylight came, there were going to be lots of helicopters coming in, lots of aerial rocket artillery. So they backed away from this thing. Now, Ted Danielson, until I wrote the chapter on 1st the 8th Cavalry for the book, 50th Anniversary of Airborne, that was put out by Turner Publications. I wrote, Ken Mertell, who was the battalion commander, asked me to write the chapter on 1st the 8th, which I did. And up until that point, Danielson had referred to the LZ as LZ Spiderweb because of all the tracers going across it at night. He didn't know it really had another name for the LZ, and he and I got to be pretty good friends later on. But there were those battles that went on earlier. The hospital fight complex. There was a guy by the name of Bill Mosey, who was a company commander of Charlie Company, that actually captured a North Vietnamese weapon that Colonel Mertell wanted. And after capturing the guy, he sent the weapon back along with the wounded North Vietnamese. And Mertell called him back on radio, and he said, I didn't know you were going to send the guy that was attached to that rifle back too. And anyway, that became kind of a standard joke. And Ken Mertell was actually offered the job as head of what they called S3 Air, and instead of sort of in charge of the helicopters for air assaults for the 1st Cavalry Division. Kennard had offered him that position. Mertell decided he wanted to command one of the airborne battalions instead. Now, 1st Brigade was airborne. That was 1st the 8th, 2nd the 8th, and 1st the 12th, plus the 2nd the 19th Artillery. So those units were airborne when they went over there. And Ken Mertell was in charge of one of those infantry battalions, and he was the one that asked me to do some of this writing. And of course, later on, he put me in a job as the publicity officer for the Jumping Mustangs, which was the guys that served in Vietnam together. We started with 23. We got about 600 guys contacted right now. But anyway, the Sergeant Major McCullough also had a real good choice of NCOs that he picked, so we had some real good NCOs over there. Now, one of the other 1st Battalion commanders was a guy from 1st to 7th, which was Harold G. Moore, who was co-author of the book We Were Soldiers Once and Young. Now, I think that's probably one of the best books on the early time in Vietnam. It captures the mood of the American people, the idea that, we thought we could defeat any foe, defend any friend. As Kennedy had said, we firmly believed in that, and a lot of guys enlisted under that concept. And Moore's book does a good job of explaining that. And also it does excellent, now I mentioned these earlier battles, those took place in October and the first part of November. The 10th of November, 3rd Brigade took over. And 3rd Brigade was the unit that Hal Moore was with, 1st to 7th, 2nd to 7th, and 1st to 5th. And that made up 2nd Brigade, or 3rd Brigade. And Hal Moore was commander of one of those battalions. McDade was commander of 2nd to the 7th. Now, the book, I'm not going to get too much into the book, but it's very accurately done. The movie is very accurately done, except for the last 10 minutes. It shows Elmore going out and chasing the North Vietnamese out of their headquarters in Chupong Massif. There were, number one, Elmore fought for 2.5 days. His troops were beat. He went out far enough to account for all of his dead and wounded and pulled them back in. Now, when McDade lost so many guys, a number of people say that McDade had a nervous breakdown during the battle and basically lost control of everything. Elmore doesn't say that in his book, but a lot of the other people who were there say that. Now, Elmore probably didn't say it because he was a fellow West Point graduate, but he didn't want to put him down. But it was actually Elmore that went out and accounted for the 3 missing guys that McDade had left behind after that battle, in which they'd lost 155. Elmore lost 79 during his battle, plus 1 Air Force officer who was flying an A-1 Skyraider that went down. In the movie, Elmore talks about, "I will leave no one behind." He, that part is played by Mel Gibson, and I think Mel Gibson does a pretty good job of portraying Moore up until that last 10 minutes.
Okay.
But
and
did you want to stop there, or did you?
well, I mean, you're kind of talking a lot about people. Now, which of these different characters were still with the division when you got there?
Okay, there were guys from Elmore's unit that had come back for a second tour, some of them that were still there. So I had a chance to interview some of them. Now, when I first got to 2nd 19th Artillery, I got there, by the time I got there it was getting dark. There was a light on the sign that said 2nd 19th Artillery on the way, airborne. I thought, hey, I originally wanted to go to an airborne unit. I'm going to an airborne unit now. And I was introduced to them, and one of the first things that they did was I had a secret clearance, so they assigned me as a courier to fly in a helicopter over Pleiku, where I dropped off some secret documents there. Flying over Pleiku was an experience because we flew across what's called the Manyang Pass. Manyang Pass is the pass between those 2 towns. It's where Group Mobile 100 was pretty much wiped out during the Vietnam War with the French. Mm-hmm. And you see that at the beginning of the movie, We Were Soldiers.
Yeah, so that's a case where they didn't do a very good job.
Yeah, and as I flew over it, I noticed that it looked like a Chinese checkerboard. There were all kinds of dents on the ground, and nice neat order, and a nice neat pattern. And I asked the pilot, I said, why does the ground look like that? They're too close together to be foxholes. And he says, well, that's where all the Frenchmen are buried. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the Viet Minh, after they won the battle, they'd go ahead and put 2 of these Frenchmen in each hole in standing position, and they'd use like a large post hole digger to dig the hole, and they were all facing back towards France. And the saying was that France is where they should have stayed. They should have never come over there. So as the bodies decayed, these left little depressions that looked like a Chinese checkerboard all across this hillside. And so that was kind of a different introduction to Vietnam and the country we were in.
Okay. Now this tape is about done, so we are
Okay.
gonna